This is a virtual reading of Conspirators, To Each His Own Agenda by Matt Gupta. Chapter 1. The Woodland Colonial Province of Magna Dacia. The crows sat docile and dumb on the tree branch. A smell of damp mud and rot lay heavy on the air of Dacia. Yet the sun shone brightly through the dense canopy of trees, as the grass below blew weak and yellow in the chilling wind. Spring was finally here. It had been a long winter, and though the chill would last for much longer, hope was beginning to return to the woodland colony. The crow perked up suddenly. Something was on the air. A low whistling, and then suddenly it was dead. One of the rangers cursed loudly, as his comrade lowered his bow with a smirk on his face. "Nobody forced you to make that wager," Gilorn the archer said. "I don't recall putting my sword to your throat." "You don't need to rub it in," Ireland, his companion, grumbled. "Well," Gilorn shrugged, "I won't, but you can go get dinner." "Dinner?" Ireland gave him an odd look. Gilorn fired another arrow, almost blindly into the foliage. There was a bark of terror, and the deer was killed. "You sack of orc piss." "Hurry up," Gilorn smiled smugly. "They'll be calling us to the front lines in a few hours." "How long has this battle been going on now?" Ireland asked, as the two men pushed through the undergrowth, their prizes over their shoulders. 4 days, Gilorn said. "I think this will be the last day, though. I've used over 400 arrows already." "Snake-loving bastards," Ireland spat on the ground. "People should know when they're conquered." "And you're saying you wouldn't fight if they marched into our home?" Gilorn smiled. "That'll be different," Ireland shook his head in an irritated huff. "That's what I thought." They walked on through the forest of Dacia in silence, and across the dirt road to the camp of Consul Flavor. Gilorn was brown-haired and bearded, fair of skin, and taller than most. He was in perfect contrast to his friend, who was grey of hair, clean-shaven, and a forehead shorter. "You had to kill the largest and heaviest fucking deer, didn't you?" Ireland complained, breathing heavily with each step. "I doubt you'll complain when your stomach is full of top-range venison." "True." Ireland groaned, with a great relief as he emptied his load onto the floor. "Let's make sure no one steals it while we're taking the front lines." "We'll share it with the Primigeno cohorts," Gilorn suggested, noting the men they had shared drinks with on the second day. "They'll look after it while we're on the front." "The one that has the governor's son?" Ireland asked in disgust. "I don't know what you have against them," Gilorn shook his head. "We're all on the same side here. Try telling them that when they lay first claim to the food rations and the loot in the camp. The Citadel Guards and the Knights have the first right to the loot, not the Hastati." "They're ahead of us," Ireland grunted. "We're common archers," Gilorn condescended. "Auxiliaries only by conscription. Everybody is ahead of us," Ireland grunted. "If we weren't neighbours, I would stab you." "Why would that stop you?" Gilorn chuckled when Ireland couldn't muster a response. "Get that meat cooking. It should be ready by the time our stint on the battlefield is done." The battlefield was a barren and terrible wasteland. It had once been lush country, but now it was a disfigured ruin. Crows were swarming over the dead like a plague of locusts, waiting to feast on the 50,000 bodies on the ground. The Saracen army stood on the far side of the field, less than a mile away. "My mother is buried on that hillside," Ireland said to Gilorn. "It's a waste," Gilorn nodded, looking up to the hill. "This land was the most fertile country in all Dacia. Why fight for it now?" "Silence!" their sergeant barked. On the far side of the field, the Saracen army, which stood at 250,000 men, had fallen into formation. The infantry stood almost equally divided between warriors and bowmen, with the heaviest spears in the centre. The horsemen, the vanguard of the army, were lined in spear-like wedge formations at the front, led by the Caliphate king's brothers and the eldest nephews. The infantry were lined up behind them, covering the whole battle line with their archers at the rear. The Roman army numbered almost 65,000 men, in 4 deep lines of troops. Although it was one of the biggest armies in history, it was still outnumbered by a huge margin. The archers were spread in the full line at the front. On either side of the line were the kingdom cavalry, both Roman knights and militia. The line behind the archers was dotted with legionary light swordsmen, leaving gaps in between them, resembling a massive chessboard. The line behind them was formed of heavier swordsman battalions, in perfect line with their lighter companions, taking up positions to quickly step into the empty spaces. Behind them were lines of the indomitable spearmen at the rear. On a slightly raised ground, the artillery, protected by a series of spiked trenches and barricades. The trebuchet stood as a symbol for the kingdom's craftsmanship and military engineering, but the army as a whole stood as the greater testament. After a long while of nothing, the battle began, with 4 horn blasts from the Roman command. 5,000 legionaries began the slow march forward. When they were far enough away from the safety of the army, the front line of the Saracens began to move. The entire cavalry force was moving up. Ilam nodded in satisfaction, after straining to see over the men in front of him. The general seems to know his stuff. The horn of Iresfield echoed across the battlefield. "Set arrows!" the sergeant shouted. "I bet you 500 denarii that one of us dies in this battle." Gilorn huffed. "You say that every battle." He knocked his arrow and aimed into the air, looking down from the sky for a moment to see the mark they were aiming at. Then he peered up at the kingdom banner, the wind blowing it slightly to the left. He adjusted his aim accordingly. "In the hopes that one day you'll get wise and agree to the bet," Ilam aimed as well. "Very well," Gilorn shrugged. "You already owe me 100 gold. What's another 5? Cynical as always." Ilam smiled. "Aim for the wings of their ranks," the sergeant shouted. "Make them cluster." Another horn blast came out. "Loose arrows!" The archers did so. The sky was momentarily blotted out by the speeding weapons, which thudded straight into the flanks of the cavalry forces. It had the desired effect. The riders on the flanks all clamoured together in a cowardly mess, making their formation smaller. They closed on the exposed legionaries and thundered into them. Though the impact rippled through the lines, the charge was stopped. It was the moment the archers had been waiting for, and a volley of 20,000 arrows slammed into the pinned-in horsemen. Another volley, and the lines were thinned again. The horsemen on the outer edges, suddenly finding themselves exposed, wheeled about and charged at the archers who had decimated them. Another horn blast exploded out. "Reform!" the sergeant shouted as the cavalry closed in. Gil and Ilam looked down at the ground beneath them. Underneath the mud and blood was a filthy rope, which the 2 rangers were standing either side of. "See you on the other side, then," Ilam smirked. The line split apart, with impossible discipline. The ranger battalions and the infantry behind them rushed into the empty spaces next to them, opening corridors into their lines, completely parallel with the oncoming horsemen. The legionaries up front took up a shield wall to buffer the stragglers into these corridors. There were many archers amongst the Saracens, and several volleys of arrows were returned to smash against the inadequately armoured rangers. The cavalry, still in their wedge formation, couldn't adapt in time to the change in formation. They couldn't risk stopping their horses for danger of smashing into each other, and they charged straight into the corridors of formations. As they sped past, the spearmen moved up and smashed straight into the cavalry. Both man and beast were impaled on the wooden poles, and screams from both horse and human punctuated the air. The charge was broken, and the next part of the plan was executed. Though the battle raged on for several hours, it could be described as if it simply lasted several minutes. The trebuchets began their bombardment as the Saracen infantry began their rapid advance across the battlefield. The Roman infantry slowly marched out to meet them, taking the last giant strides in the full sprint. When the infantry was pinned in place, the knights flanked around them and eliminated their archers at the rear. Soon the army was surrounded and broke under its own weight, as a mass panic swept over the men. The horns sounded an aggressive advance, and Gilorn found himself in the enemy camp, nearly 2 miles from where he began. As the army pushed on, the last of the Saracen resistance was defeated. The army crossed the wasteland and moved into the enemy camp. It tore through any warrior who ran or surrendered. Some of them fought, but no quarter was given. Gilorn and Ilam leapt onto a fence, and then onto a roof of a tent, to fire arrows at anyone they could see. "I should tell you something," Ilam said calmly, as he loosed another arrow. "It's probably not the best time to get sentimental," Gilorn said, without drifting his attention from his firing. "I'm nearly out of arrows," Ilam said, "and as are you." Gilorn agreed. "Focus your fire on the archers, and we'll go down and get some ourselves." "Good," Ilam nodded. "You can go first. Try not to shoot yourself in the foot. We're not boys anymore, my friend," Ilam smirked, firing his last arrow. "Now go." Gilorn let down from the tent roof and pulled out his sword. He dived at the nearest corpse he found and tore off the quiver. He threw it up to Ilam, who caught it by the arrows, letting the leather fall down to the ground, and continued to shoot, holding the arrows in a fist as he shot. Gilorn swung his sword around in a circle. He was by far a better archer than the swordsman. He took out the legs of a fleeing spearman and stabbed wildly into another. Fortunately, the later victim was an archer. He tried to pull his sword out of him, but the blade was stuck firm. Blood flowed freely from the man's mouth as he fell with a crash, his sand-coloured robes drenched in blood. He let the sword go with the man as he ripped the quiver from him. The arrows were an odd shape and slender, but they would do. Leaving his sword, he made his way into the camp. he found himself in an open area at the crossroads. 3 horn blasts burst out in quick rhythm, loud and thunderous. Out of the wasteland they had crossed, a procession of 30 mounted men approached. The black standard of Icefield blew in the wind behind them. The perfect white swords crossed over a laurel wreath. General Flavor had entered the camp with his citadel bodyguards, assigned to him from the highest echelons of private protection. They approached Gilorn as if he wasn't there. Gilorn looked up at the general, tall and majestic, with his blood-red cloak blowing out behind him in the wind. Even from here, in all of his Roman splendour, Gilorn could see the clear marks of Saxon heritage. He looked around the camp, and his eyes fell on Gilorn. "Archer," he said, addressing the space above Gilorn's head. "Sir?" Gilorn nodded. "Why do you bear the arrows of our enemies?" "Too many enemies to shoot, sir," Gilorn said honestly. "I needed more." Flavor blinked once and nodded. "Citadel Guard!" he shouted. "This is your camp now. Go tell them." "Shall we not fight with you, sir?" the Citadel captain asked. "Enjoy yourselves," Flavor shook his head. "Fight with your brothers before the world, and earn your keep as Rome's grandest sons." "Was that wise, my lord?" Gilorn asked, immediately regretting speaking out of turn. No one of his social status would ever dream of speaking to a captain general, a consul of the kingdom, let alone question his orders. "Wise?" Flavor said. He looked down at him with a fierce look, and then shook his head. "I think not. The right thing to do? Yes. My men grow fat as much as the next man, even more so since all we do is sit at the back of the battle." "You leave the army, my lord. Everyone in the army idolizes you. I hardly think you're lazy." Gilorn quickly tried to recover his composure. "Maybe not," Flavor began, but there was a war cry of a Saracen as he rushed at Gilorn. Gilorn spun around him, throwing him to the floor and shooting him in the back. As if he knew they were there, he fired another arrow upwards into the neck of an archer on top of the tent, and with his final arrow he fired into the air. A Hashashin, an assassin of the most terrible order, had climbed onto a tent and made a huge leap at Flavor. He had moved in complete silence, and Flavor had been caught without a sword in his hand. The arrow caught the Hashashin in the chest. Without any armour, the steel pierced his heart, and he was dead before he hit the ground. Flavor said, pulling out his sword. "Impressive. Thank you, General." "Imperator!" A Citadel guardsman galloped over him. He paused, looking at the corpses around them. We found the enemy king." "Where?" Flavor shouted, all pretence of niceties gone. He is retreating to the south." "Move!" Flavor urged him forward. "Archer, come with us." Gilorn's eyes widened at this. He nodded and grabbed another quiver of arrows. He let out a sigh of sadness, seeing that it was an armoured archer of Icefeld. They rushed through the corridor of the camp until they were almost at the other side. They arrived to see the Citadel Guard captain was fighting with a spear against several dark-skinned Numidian mercenaries. The guard captain was impossibly outnumbered, but he was deftly holding his own. He spun his spear around with brilliant precision and balance, his black and gold-imbued cloak flying out like a great banner. With a series of well-timed blocks, spiralling parries, and acrobatic kicks, he was suddenly on the offensive. He threw out his spear in wide arcs and stabs so powerful the spear left his hands, until, with a brutal splitting of a man's skull, he fell back into a hawk-like stance to await the next attack. "Well fought, Camiran," Flavor called loudly, to wake him from his combat pose. Camiran sprang to attention, swinging his spear backwards in a wide arc and resting it lazily on his shoulders. He saluted in typical Roman fist bang to his chest. "General," he called back, his voice quite high-pitched for a man who looked so grim. "Where is the king?" Flavor ordered. "My men ambushed him as he attempted to flee," Camiran explained. "But these mercenaries drew my forces away before we could close the cage on him. I fear he has escaped." "No," Gilorn interrupted, pointing his bow out towards a series of grassy hills. "There he is." "He's still too far," Camiran retorted, looking at Gilorn with suspicious anger for speaking out of turn. Flavor roared in rage. "I'll kill you for your desertion, coward! Come and face me!" The entourage of horses stopped and turned back to them. They shouted something back in the Sand People tongue, and then continued their exodus. "We must rally our cavalry," Camiran suggested, falling away from his stance of attention. "It will take too long," Flavor shook his head, waking up from his anger. He turned to Gilorn. "Ranger!" Gilorn didn't wait for him to finish. He knocked the arrow with a satisfying slap to the bowstave. He set his finger against the arrow and pulled back, his back curving as he put his full weight into the bow, and raised it to point at the sky. He took a slight glance down at his target and then released. The Golden King was easy to determine, as he was dressed all in purple, and his golden crown shone brightly in the sunlight. He was also the only armoured horse, as all of his king's snake guard simply had brown horses. The arrow flew out of sight and there was silence, save for the seemingly distant echoes of the battle around them. I said he was too far, comrade sighed. I'll rally The Golden King suddenly fell off his horse. You hit him. So I did, Gilorn agreed, slightly surprised at himself. It hadn't been a hard shot, he had performed better in the past, but he was still surprised. They could see the King's Snake Guard leaping off their horses into their fallen king, crying out his name in reassurance. After a moment, they screamed out in agony and despair in their own tongue. He is dead! Everyone nodded. Assemble the horsemen, he said to the captain, suddenly cheerful. I want his body. Find the sergeants. I want a report from each of them, and I want this part of the battle done quickly. Yes, General. And you, Favour glanced down at Gilorn. Stay alive, Ranger. I'll have need of you later. You have won yourself much honour and glory. He urged on his horse and galloped away. He's right, Comrade smiled, departing with a swagger that Gilorn didn't expect. It's not every day that one gets to kill a king. And he, too, left. Was that the General? Ireland said, rushing over to Gilorn. Yes, it was, Gilorn said, and I think I may have just killed the Golden King. He pointed across the field where he'd just shot. Normally I wouldn't believe you, Ireland tilted his head, but people who are making a run for it don't suddenly turn back and attack, unless you really piss them off. Yes, Gilorn agreed. Let's find better ground.